Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go! I work for a law enforcement agency in a pretty wealthy area, and the people can be a bit entitled, but not all. I have worked several jobs since I finished school, like dispatcher, records department, and finally moved into my current role, which is a hybrid of IT and equipment. I do all the testing and issue reports on non-tactical/ballistic items that we use. My biggest task is the vehicles themselves. Now currently we are testing out back seats for the patrol cruisers. If you've ever seen one, they are generally just plastic and very uncomfortable. They aren't meant for comfort, but problems do arise due to how slippery they are. The primary goal is easy to clean up and nearly impossible for someone to try and conceal an item in the crease of cushions on a normal car. So, a new vendor approached us with a new material that goes in the back. It's non-stick and has some cushioning underneath, so they install it on one vehicle. And I call up the officer who handles tactical/ballistic equipment purchases to schedule testing the vehicle out. Per our city's guidelines, we have to test it for a minimum of 12 hours in addition to testing that the manufacturer has done. So I arranged with the officer to spend part of 2 days driving around, alternating with me sitting in the back handcuffed and also him in the back not handcuffed. I was simulating the role of a detained person in custody while the officer would be playing the role of a witness who was being transported. Also, we would get in trouble legally if I cuffed him for the simulation. So, problem solved. The first day went by okay, but the complaint we both had was that it's a bit unrealistic to be sitting in the back of a car for more than 30 to 45 minutes, as it virtually never happens. Also, it's basically a yoga mat you're sitting on, but denser material, so not so much padding. So on the second day, I brought a pillow from home for my back, fused vertebrae. When we were just about finished with the second day, it was around lunch and we decided to get lunch. The officer parks in front of a restaurant and lets me out and uncuffs me. I said, "Thank you, Jeeves. Can you please get the door and we'll be off?" Unfortunately, a woman heard this and thought I was ordering a cop around and treating him like a servant. She screamed at the top of her lungs that criminals like me don't get to order cops around, that I obviously must be a criminal. The officer tried to explain to her that I work with him and it was a joke. Nope, she's not buying that, not even when I get out my ID and show her. Nope, she's convinced I'm a criminal. She calls 911 and demands that the chief come out and explain these shenanigans. Yeah, not happening. The watch commander comes out, explains it, and scolds me and the other officer for making jokes while in an official capacity. The woman is absolutely incredulous that we weren't going to be arrested and terminated on the spot. So of course she smacks the watch commander and demands he do his job. Long story short, someone got arrested. My wife and I both ride motorcycles and we've started doing track days together. We have rented a garage next to our friends so we can hang out between sessions. Renting a garage is more than $50 per day. But we have space out of the sun, power for the tire warmers and plumbed air lines for setting tire pressures or running tools. We think it's worth it. We showed up for our track day and our assigned parking spot for the garage was filled with other trucks and trailers, and someone had set up in our garage. They were still unloading more bikes and tools. The guy even put down a rug. The head guy of the group said he had rented the garage for the following 2 days, race days. He wanted it for the track day for testing and tuning his bike. He said he had a garage for the day booked at the far end of the track, and it's okay, he can go use that one. Like it was a done deal. I told him no, that we booked and paid for this garage for most of the season for a reason. He got huffy and said he didn't want to move all his stuff, and I was done at this point. We needed to unload and a trailer was blocking the paddock road. I told him sorry, but that's not my problem. He knew what garage he booked, he saw the reservation posted on the wall with our names, and decided to move in regardless. Plus, he had a garage to use, it just wasn't in his prime spot. I pulled the car in behind their truck close enough to plug the tailgate so they couldn't sit up the ramp to get the other bikes out and began unloading our own gear into the garage. It finally packed up and his friends stopped unloading. I've been reading a lot of Reddit stories lately, so I figured I'd share this story that happened a few months ago. I'm 26 years old and I'm a police officer who normally works the night shift, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. On this particular day, I was in a training class that was scheduled from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Standard uniform attire for classes are the blue polo shirt with department logo on chest and khaki pants. I had my service weapon and badge on the right side of my hip, and my handcuffs, extra magazine, and radio on the left side of my hip. After the class ended, I went to my local supermarket known for low prices and blue shirts to get some things for dinner. While I'm there, a little kid who looked around 9 to 10 years old walked up to me. He asked me, "Are you a police officer?" while pointing to my service weapon. "Yes, I am. I want to be a police officer when I grow up." He says that with much excitement. When I'm in uniform, I always carry around little plastic badges for when I run into kids. So I stood there for a few minutes talking to the kid while his mother was shopping in the aisle. When they go to leave, I give the kid the plastic badge and say, "Here you go, little buddy. You're now a junior officer." He smiled big and gave me a hug. He was so excited and started saying in a sing-song tune, I'm a cop, I'm gonna get all the bad guys." The kid and his mom walk off and I go back to my shopping. I kneel down to look at some chips I'm thinking of getting when I hear someone clear their throat. I turn and see a lady, Karen, who looks to be in her early to mid-40s. The lady glares at me and I go back to looking at the chips. "Excuse me, are you going to help me or not? I need to know where." I cut her off and said, "Ma'am, I don't work here. You'll have to find an employee." "Don't lie to me, you're dressed like an employee. You obviously work here." Now keep in mind, I am not wearing the yellow vest most employees wear. I'm just wearing a blue polo shirt and khakis. I stand up and turn to her, showing her my department logo on my shirt, and pointing to my badge. "Ma'am, I don't work here. I'm an off-duty officer." I don't understand what went through her mind when she said, "Stop lying. Why do you have a gun? You're not supposed to have a gun while working. Where is your manager?" I sighed. I've dealt with many Karens on duty and I knew where this was going. "Ma'am, I don't work here. My supervisor is Sergeant Dan. I don't work for the store." At this point, Karen looks mad and is staring at me like I'm lying here. Karen then yells, "You lying little jerk. I swear old people your age are just lazy and never want to help anyone. I want your manager now." I again inform her that I don't work for the business. I even pulled out my credentials, which is a photo identification card of me in uniform, with a department name and logo and has officer under my photo. It should also be noted that I keep my driver's license and debit card and my credentials as I have to have them on me at all times when I'm in public. Just makes it easier to keep everything together. Karen snatches my credentials out of my hand and stuffs them into her purse and says, "These are fake. I am taking these and showing them to your manager and the real police." "Ma'am, you have just committed simple robbery, which in my state is a taking of anything of value which is in the immediate control of another with force but not armed with a dangerous weapon. This crime is a felony and punishable by up to 7 years in prison. Return my credentials now or I will be forced to place you under arrest." "You can't arrest me because you're not a cop." I remove my radio from my hip and inform the dispatcher that I need units to my location for a signal 65. Simple robbery. Dispatcher acknowledges and I hear 3 units state that they were en route. I place my radio back on my hip and tell Karen she's now being placed under arrest. As I go to grab her left wrist, she slaps me with her right hand saying, "Don't touch me! Help! I'm being attacked!" I yell at her, "You have now committed battery on a police officer. Stop resisting or you will go to the ground." I notice people are now forming, wondering what was going on. I hear on the radio that the units are on scene and asking for my location. I press the radio button and give them my aisle. A few moments later, 3 fully uniformed officers show up. Officer 1 asks me what happened. I give him the rundown while Karen is spewing all sorts of lies of how I threatened her with my gun and how I had attacked her to Officer 2. Officers 1 and 2 stay with us while Officer 3 goes to the security office to play back the cameras. While waiting on Officer 3, I'm chit-chatting with the other 2 officers. I went through the police academy with one of them. We hear Officer 3 saying over the radio to the other 2 officers to 10-15 Karen, which means place her in handcuffs and arrest her. The 2 officers do so, and they are placing her in handcuffs and reading her Miranda rights. She starts struggling and saying that she's innocent and that they should arrest me for pretending to be a cop and attacking her. Officer 1 tells her, "Lady, we have you on video. You've been lying to us this whole time. You're under arrest for simple robbery, battery on a police officer, disturbing the peace, and now resisting arrest. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Another officer tells her. The 3rd officer walks up to us with a copy of the camera footage, and all 3 walk Karen to the backseat of Officer 1's car. I spend the next few minutes explaining to the sergeant on duty who showed up about what happened, filling out a statement of the incident, and having photographs taken. The photographs are standard procedure whenever we arrest someone for battery on a police officer. Once everything is said and done, my credentials are returned to me, Karen is taken to jail, and I go home. I'm never stopping at that business again when I'm wearing my training class uniform. Several years ago, my brother Dan moved from California to Washington State and built a 3-bedroom house on one of 2 parcels of land he had bought when he was 18 years old. He lived in a nice community with a small lake and had an HOA. During the 2008 economic crash, he ran into financial trouble, so we helped him. To repay us for the help, in March of 2016, he came down to California for an extended period to work on our house, which was neglected because of helping him. He was very proficient at renovating houses and did fantastic work. In November, my brother's friend Jake called him and asked if a friend of his, Tuna, could stay in one of the rooms for $400 a month. Dan had worked for many years with Jake doing construction for a house flipper, so he trusted Jake's judgment, needed the money, and thought it might be good to have someone trustworthy there to watch his house. Dan drove back up to Washington, cleaned out a room, put a lock on his bedroom door, locked the door, and put some of his things in a storage area up out of the way in the garage. Tuna seemed nice and gave Dan $400 for the first month. There was never a written rental agreement. It was just verbal and meant to be temporary because Dan was going to return in 6 months. Tuna never sent another payment. We would call and ask her, and she always said it had been sent, but nothing ever arrived. So what was going on at his house? We pieced together that something wrong was going on there after Dan's neighbor called, and after questioning Jake. The neighbor complained that the house had turned into a drug house full of people and cars coming and going all hours of the night. At the beginning of June 2017, Dan drove back to Washington and handed Tuna a 3-day eviction notice. She left, stating that she had somewhere else to live and would get her stuff later. He was allowing her to retrieve her stuff at a later date. He just wanted her out. He started working on repairs and cleaning up the house. I mailed Dan a care package with some clothes, a California-themed shopping bag, and gift cards for gas and food. 5 days later, Tuna showed up with 2 men who punched Dan in the face. They wanted to take the house back by force. Dan went to the neighbor and called the police. The police came, and instead of arresting the men and Tuna, they took Dan to jail for missing a child support court date, which then put a warrant on him. Before coming to California, he thought everything regarding child support back payments for his independent, successful 23-year-old adult child had been taken care of. He had no idea about a court date since they notify by mail. and Tuna had never forwarded his mail, which was one of the things she promised to do. The child support scam on Dan is another issue I will have to submit later. So the police essentially handed the house over to Tuna. She and her cronies went in, changed the locks, and placed a long metal bar across the inside of the garage door so it could not be opened from the outside. They stole the package I sent to Dan and spent the gift cards. Meanwhile, my family and I were on vacation in Hawaii, and I received a phone call from Dan in jail. I spent the whole day of my vacation in a hotel room trying to figure out how to get him out of jail. Bail bonds could not be used for child support cases. Finally, they let him out when I paid a child support payment of $350. He had been in jail for 3 days and the squatters had dug themselves in. So when he returned to his house, he had to call the police to arrest them for trespassing. After all, Tuna had been evicted, left, and no longer had permission to be there. They were squatters by all accounts, but the state differs to people who just claim they are renting, therefore requiring a landlord to go through the court system to remove the so-called tenants, who are actually squatters. The police came and screwed him over once again. Tuna claimed she was renting the entire house, and the police believed her instead of Dan. She told the policeman that she would leave in 10 days, and the policeman told Dan that he could have his house back in 10 days because Tuna said she would leave by then. Are you kidding me? Dan was instructed to leave the premises or be arrested. It was his house. She was trespassing. He got into his minivan and drove away with nowhere to stay but his van. Of course, Tuna did not leave after 10 days. Dan went back after 10 days and called the police again. Once again, the police told him to leave or be arrested. We did not know what to do next. One of the HOA board members who had some experience in managing real estate properties attempted to help us. She said that he needed a 20-day eviction notice, then Tuna would be out. This had always worked for her when she had to evict tenants. Okay, so the 20-day notice was posted and we waited. Tuna did not leave. Dan went over to his house and started cleaning up trash strewn all over the yard, waiting for her to leave. Tuna called the police, stating that she was a renter and he was disturbing her. Once again, Dan was asked to leave or be arrested. This time, Dan put his phone on speaker, and I heard the whole interaction between him and the police. Yes, he had to leave or be arrested. Dan could not even get his construction tools out of the garage and could not work without his tools. I was being homeless, how do you even work? What was going to happen to all of his possessions, his sentimental things? His room had been broken into long before, his things removed and people had used the room. It was near the end of the summer, we were paying his mortgage payments, and it was getting so hard on everyone. Then something nice happened. A kind friend, Adam, asked him to stay at his house, which Dan did. During this time, Dan worked for Adam with loan tools, and also went to some landlord/tenant educational meetings. The people at the meetings were helpful and instructed Dan on how to proceed by taking the matter to the court. The police would not go further without a court order to physically evict Tuna. It would be difficult to afford the cost to hire a lawyer, but eventually we did end up getting a lawyer. Dan posted a court appearance on the door of his house, since Tuna never answered the door, and that is what you do legally in this case. Every time he posted a court appearance, he had to legally give her 1 week notice, which he did. He showed up at court and Tuna failed to show up. So, he won by default, right? Wrong. The judge said that Tuna was not given proper notice because a notice was posted by Dan instead of an anonymous person. Dad walked out of the courtroom. The lawyers from the landlord/tenant meetings were there and just couldn't believe it. Unfortunately, Adam had to move out of his house he was renting, so Dan had to go back to living in his van. It was autumn in the Pacific Northwest and getting cold. The police had started harassing him if he slept in his van. We rented motel rooms for Dan. Once, while at a motel, Dan heard a knock on the door in the middle of the night. He thought it was a motel staff and opened the door. 2 men burst into the room and proceeded to beat the crap out of him to rob him. They broke his finger and gave him a concussion. Dan ran to his van, drove it to a parking lot and slept. He refused to go back to the motel. Things were starting to go downhill in a very bad way. I found a lawyer from a non-profit who worked for free to help. He actually used that 3-day eviction notice that Dan had given Tuna back in June as a basis for the case. I had found it online. The wording was appropriate and it had been served properly. The lawyer had to jump through endless hoops and court appearances, and the same judge presided over every case that had to do with evictions, and she always favored the tenants, including entitled ones. This took forever, like 3 more months, and Dan became haggard, homeless, sick, depressed, and at times had gone missing. Once I called every hospital, jail, homeless shelter, and even the food bank looking for him. His van was impounded 4 times. He was hospitalized 4 times. He was endlessly hunted down and harassed by the police. 3 times I found him because I was listed as his emergency contact on his state insurance when he showed up at hospitals. While all of this was happening to Dan, my husband was in a serious motorcycle accident, and I had to take care of my husband, changing his dressings and so on. Okay, I'm crying right now. This was so hard to endure, remember, and very difficult to write about. I couldn't leave and fly up to Washington to help my brother, but I was doing everything down here to get his house back with a lawyer. I got him motel rooms at other motels when I could. I paid 4 times to get his van out of impound. I sent him cell phones and care packages delivered at UPS stores. One time Dan was lost and didn't have his van or phone. He ended up at a hospital who contacted me. He told me that he had felt really sick and had gone to the hospital earlier, who released him after examining him, even after he pleaded with them to let him stay because he felt horribly sick. He ended up collapsing on a sidewalk by the Salvation Army shelter, who wouldn't let him in, and another homeless person called 911. So he was back at that hospital with a very serious condition affecting his heart. I told the hospital to please call me at release time so I could arrange a motel for Dan. They didn't. He was then found in a park in frigid weather, dressed in a pair of scrubs, a t-shirt, hoodie, and 1 shoe. A city policeman called me and took him to a motel, where he stayed a while. I sent a care package there. Dan told me that one time when he was being harassed by the police for cooking food in a park, he mouthed off and told them they were communists, and it was their fault that he was homeless because they gave his house to a squatter. A fire truck arrived, so he was not arrested with a fireman there, but I don't think the police liked him much for saying that. In October, Dan was arrested for drunk driving while he was sleeping in a Walmart parking lot. I had to bail him out of jail over that. Every time he didn't get to court hearings, they would post warrants for his arrest. One time he was in jail and they refused to give him his medication, so I had to bail him out because he felt so awful. In mid-November, the police arrested Dan again for not showing up to court for that so-called drunk driving incident. He begged me to bail him out, even though the bail bondsman paid the bail. In the late afternoon, the jail released him in the middle of the night, again with no vehicle, impounded, a dead cell phone, no charger, in the van, no money, and so on. I found out later that this jail only releases people at night, so they can get credit and are paid by the state for the whole day. That night he was released. It was our deceased mother's birthday. Dan was then found unconscious in a ditch by a seawall in a Starbucks parking lot. He had a broken femur, broken hip, cracked spine, a head contusion, and that finger was still broken from the motel incident. The doctors evaluated that he had been hit in the back of his head with a blunt object. We do not know who did it. The last thing he remembers was a police car driving by. He was airlifted to a major hospital in Seattle, about 50 miles from where he was. I took a flight up to Seattle as soon as I could and visited him. The doctors showed me the x-rays and he had countless rods and pins put into his body to put him back together. By this time we were getting closer to having his house back. I went by the house with Adam's brother-in-law, Paul, who was packing heat. We pounded on a door and I demanded that the squatters hand over my dead mother's rocking chair. The stupid friend Jake was there and he handed it through the door. It's a big heirloom mission-style chair, and they have burned into the chair in 4-inch letters the word wasted. The court order finally became available, but then we had to schedule the eviction according to when the police had time to do it, which was another 2 weeks. It was scheduled for the beginning of December. I went back home to California briefly and returned the night of the eviction. Dan was in a hospital for almost 2 weeks. When he was released, I arranged a nice long-term stay type hotel back near home for him to live at until the police evicted the squatters. Paul helped us a lot. He was with the police at the eviction, changed all the locks, and secured the house. He picked up Dan at the hotel and then got to witness the eviction of that entitled witch from hell. She was the only one left in the house. A notice had been posted on a door to warn everyone to leave, but as usual, she didn't think there would be any reason she would have to leave. It took her completely by surprise. The police pounded on a door and demanded that she leave immediately. She asked if she could get this and that, but no, she couldn't. She grabbed her little dog, purse, and left with nothing else. The police put a notice on a door after Paul secured everything. Dan was driven back to the hotel and then I arrived. I wish I could have seen the eviction, but couldn't get a flight early enough. The neighbors said that a bunch of people came to the house that night pounding on a door trying to get in, but couldn't. They almost called the police, but the people left. We went over there every day for about a week to clean up. Dan was confined to a wheelchair. I was on heavy meds, so it was hard. He couldn't help too much, but did his best. The house was a disaster. There was literally 5 tons of garbage in the yards around the house. The trash disposal service was not activated during this time, so they just piled it up around the house. One side of the house was a huge pillar of trash made out of wire fencing. It was about 8 feet by 8 feet and at least 12 feet high. The front yard was awful with several piles of trash about 4 feet high. Tuna left every single thing in the kitchen, in the cupboard, and rotting food in pans. The carpets were soaked in dog pee. There were clothes and junk everywhere. There were loads of crushed glass embedded into the gravel driveway like she wanted us to get flat tires. Over the doorway from the house into the garage was a dangerous booby trap, which literally could have killed someone. It was made out of large heavy metal clamps with a glass jewelry case tethering on top of the clamps. It could have fallen on top of someone's head if not discovered, and someone jarred it a little. The water had been shut off for months by the HOA because they controlled the well and owned the water system. As soon as you don't pay the HOA fees, water is shut off. All the toilets were clogged up with crap. The sewage system was impossible to unclog, and later DB discovered that they had thrown dirt and plastic containers down the pipes. He had to go under the house and disassemble the pipes to get everything out. Hanging up on the wall in plain sight in the master bedroom was a California shopping bag I had mailed to Dan in the package that Tuna had stolen. She hung it there to taunt me. I'm not super religious, but I felt the worst kind of evil there and had to pray and debunk the evil spirits from that house. I stayed for weeks there cleaning up and hired some people to do yard clean out to get the front yard clean. Later Dan and Adam dealt with a pillar of trash at the side of the house. Every construction tool that belonged to Dan was stolen. He couldn't work much from a wheelchair, but needed the tools to repair his own house. Dan persisted though. He finally got to the point where he could walk. Now, he can't walk for long periods, gets tired easily, but can do things slowly. He has some nice roommates that drive him places and take care of him at times. Many of his tools have been replaced. He sent off the wasted message, "Our mom